All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have some additional people join as we go on. Let me get my screen set up here. There we go. All right, so first off, just hope everybody's doing well. Everybody's healthy and safe. I know it's, things are starting to open back up, but hopefully everybody's still practicing social distancing, washing hands, wearing masks, and so forth. It's a unique time, hence this meeting being done via the internet, but it is a unique time, and we're moving forward the best we can with what we can do. Before I get into the presentation, let me just make a couple of really quick announcements. For those that don't know, this coming Saturday, June 6th, we have the corridor cleanup from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., where we'll be cleaning up the Southfield Road corridor. If you're interested in helping out, contact City Hall. There's information also on the website, city website, as well as the city Facebook page. And then after that, from 11 to 2, at 11 in Evergreen at the Michigan First Credit Union, we're doing a food produce giveaway. So farmers have lots of extra food because the demand from restaurants is so much lower. And so there's a lot of surplus produce, and so and by we I mean our mayor, Kelly Garrett, has arranged for 20-pound produce boxes to be given away to Lathrup Village residents. We've got 1,200 of them. All you have to do is drive up. It's contactless. You tell them how many boxes you want. They'll put it in your trunk or in your cargo area, and you're good to go. So hopefully you'll spread the word on that, and people will take advantage of that. So this presentation will probably take about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and to get public comment, which we really want. Again, I think we all know that the whole coronavirus situation is affecting the economy. We don't know what the end effect is going to be. It could be a mild recession with a quick recovery as things start to open up towards the beginning of the summer, or we might go into a full depression that might take years to get out of. It could be anywhere in between. So we're cognizant of that as a committee, but if we do decide to do something, a ballot or a decision has to be made to get an initiative on the ballot by mid-August. So the good news is we should have a much better sense of what the economy is doing by then. And just to note, a very real possibility could be that this committee, if the economy is in the tank, the committee might recommend not putting something on the ballot. So that's a very real possibility, depending on the economic outlook. But the worst thing for us to do would to be, just sit around and not move forward on this, and then find out that in August things are okay or near okay, and we want to put something on the ballot, but it's too late. So we're continuing to move forward, and I should also mention that even if we decide not to put something on the ballot in November, all the work we're doing now will be applicable to the next election, which would be the following May, where if the economy was better, we could then just put whatever plan we come up with on the ballot at that time. So the goal tonight is to introduce and discuss the three potential plans that the Infrastructure Committee has come up with to fix our roads and ditches. We really want to get people's input, find out what you like, what you don't like, find out which of the three plans that we introduce that you think is best for the community. And so that's our main goal tonight. And again, we understand COVID-19 and its potential effects, but what we want to do is discuss this and look at its strengths and weaknesses, and ask you to kind of put your December of 2019 hat on before we'd ever heard of coronavirus, and just analyze these plans for what they are, for their strengths and weaknesses. Real quickly, I want to introduce the team. Most of them are on the call. Joe Robinson, who works for the Detroit Water Department. Hugo Cardenas, I don't think he's on the call yet, but he works for the Washtenaw County Road Commission. Mike Keenan, who's an engineer. Mike Griffin. Mike, are you an engineer?
No, I'm not an engineer.
Remind me what you do again. I forgot again.
I work on financial filings, regulatory filings.
Oh yeah, that's right. Regulatory filings.
Yep.
Yeah. So Mike is our newest add to the team. As a lot of you may know, Mike was not in favor of the November proposal, and so we brought him onto the team to get his unique perspective and to really help us, work on a more balanced solution that might be acceptable to the voters. And then in addition, we also have Scott Ringler, who's our city engineer, Cheryl Mitchell, who's our city administrator, Salim Siddiqui, who I don't know if he's on the call yet, but he's another city council member, and then Scott Baker, who is our city attorney. So they've all acted as advisors. And the group that I just mentioned, we've been working since the election in November. And one of the nice things about, I guess in retrospect, about having a somewhat contentious ballot initiative is it really puts a focus on our roads and ditches. And so people got really engaged. And so at our meetings that we've had since November, we've had a great turnout. We've had a really good group of people have been showing up. They've been supplying great suggestions and ideas. And in fact, we've used a lot of those suggestions and ideas to integrate them into the three plans that we're going to discuss. And then just lastly, I wanted to mention, we haven't forgotten, the lessons learned from the November election. There were a lot of things that were said, some of them accurate, some of them not accurate. But it was, there was a definite perception among the voters, and I've reminded the team on a couple of occasions of some of the things that people were saying, because I wanted them to be cognizant of them as we deliberate and kind of work towards a solution. So those were things like, the city should be able to pay for the roads with the money we already give them. The cost of the plan was too high. It wasn't fair to new residents. People didn't have enough time for input and thought the process was rushed. It was too extreme. All roads didn't need to be touched. 19 years was too long. People who lived in the estate section on the dirt roads didn't want their dirt roads paved. So there were a lot of things that we heard. And again, I did remind the team of that on a couple of different occasions, just so that we're constantly thinking of it as we're crafting a new solution, or new solutions, I should say. So I want to kind of get into the three very different approaches that we've come up with. And what I'll do is I'll go through all three plans before opening it up for public comment. But everybody who's on the call or on the meeting, whether you're connected through Zoom or I know some people are just connected via phone only, regardless, you'll have a chance to provide input and let us know what you think about the plans. And then I also want to mention that the numbers that I'm throwing out should be pretty close to actual, but they are still approximations. And if we decide to go with any one of these plans, obviously we will hone it in and get exact numbers, which we would be required to do by law before putting it on the ballot. So last November, one of the things that I got asked a lot was, why didn't we just do, a simple millage and ask the people for, 5 mills for, a few years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and just take that extra money that we get from that millage and put it towards the roads, dedicate it towards the roads, and make a dent into our road problem. And that's something that we would have loved to have done. But the problem that we have is that there's a set of state regulations that put limitations on how much a city can levy in terms of a millage rate for its general operating fund. And for Lathrup Village, it's 20 mills. And we're currently levying at 20 mills. So we couldn't do that, because by doing what people were asking, that would have added to our general operating fund, and we can't pull in more than 20 mills for our general operating fund. So one way to work around those limitations is to define a specific project and then pay for it with a debt service millage. And that's what we did last November. And in fact, some of the plans that we'll talk about tonight use that same approach. Another way to work around that limitation is to leverage what's called a public safety millage, where you have a millage for the police and the fire department, and that can free up some money, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. The other thing I just wanted to mention as well before I get into the plans is, remember that there are two very related infrastructure systems that we have problems with that we're trying to fix. Not only the roads, but also the ditches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the three plans and how they relate to the ditches, and how they relate to the roads, and all the costs I'll be talking about during those three plans are for the roads only. And then when we're done talking about the roads, then I'll bring the ditches back in and talk a little bit about what we're proposing about the ditches. So with that said, let's begin to move into the actual plan. And let me mention, if you're not familiar with Zoom, if the presentation is too small or too big, you can do the pinch thing or the squeeze down thing if you're on a tablet or a phone. If you're working on your computer, there should be a menu option up at the top which allows you to change the view to 100%, 150%, 50%, and so forth. So you can kind of adjust the percent of the presentation so it looks good on your screen. So this is the first plan that I want to introduce. And basically the idea behind this plan was that we wanted to get a good chunk of money every year for 10 years that we could put towards an annual paving program. And so in this example, what we said is we wanted to try to raise $850,000 a year. And by doing that, we should be able to have a pretty significant road project every summer. And that's actually a little bit more than 3 times what we spend on roads to do the 0.4 miles of road that we do every year currently. So this would allow us to do make some substantial headway over 10 years. And so what we wanted to do with this program in order to kind of minimize the hit to the taxpayers is we wanted to try to pull the funds for this program from multiple sources. And to get this $850,000, essentially what that equates to is we would need to come up with 5.7 mils. And so as I said, we decided to try to get those 5.7 mils from different sources. And so the first source was our city general operating fund. So every year for the last 7 years, the city has dedicated anywhere from 1.1 to 1.7 mils to the roads to do the 0.4 miles of road that we do every summer. And over that 7 years, it's averaged out to about 1.4 mils. So what we thought was, let's take a conservative approach, and based on that data, we should be able to dedicate 1.2 mils every year from the general operating fund to the roads. So the first facet here would be that we would ask City Council to dedicate 1.2 mils of the budget every year towards the roads for 10 years. The second area where we would try to get additional mills for this particular project is doing something called a Headley Override. And again, just to remind people what Headley is, because I know people don't live it and breathe it every day like some of us do, Headley is a state tax regulation, and basically what it says is that in any year where the aggregate taxable value of the city goes up, we have to drop the millage rate so that we get no more revenue than we got in the prior year. Okay, so it was a way of limiting the amount of revenue that cities could get from one year to the next. So in 2003, we voted in as residents our latest charter, which allowed us to levy 20 mils as our tax rate. And so what happened was we started levying 20 mils, and from 2003 to 2010, for the most part, we had pretty substantial property value growth. And so what ended up happening is as we continued to grow and grow and grow in terms of our property value, our millage rate dropped and dropped and dropped. So by the time we got to 2010, our millage rate had dropped all the way down to 16 mils. So we had lost about 25% of our taxing power because of this Headley amendment. And so in 2010, for those of you who have been long-term residents, what you may remember is we voted in what was called a Headley Override, which was a one-time thing where we as citizens told the city that, okay, if we realize the millage rate is dropped down to 16, you can go ahead and put it back up to 20. And so that was a one-time thing. So in 2010, we put it back to 20 mils. And as you remember, in 2010, we were in a recession, and we stayed in a recession until 2014. So we stayed at 20 mils. But starting in 2014 up to the present day, property values started to go up again, so our millage rate started to go down. And if you look here on the screen, you can see our millage rate has actually fallen now to about 18.19 mils. And so what we would propose is if we decided to go with this plan, is to put on the ballot in November a Headley Override, only we would make it permanent for 10 years. So for 10 years, Headley would not be able to reduce our revenue, or I'm sorry, our tax rate. And so if we went back to 20 mils, given that we're at 18.19 mils right now, what that would mean is that would give us an extra 1.8 mils relative to what we have today, and that money could then be put towards the roads. Now I also put down here the refuse, which is the leaves, the trash, and the recycling, because when we did a Headley Override in 2010, we applied it to both of those millages. We're supposed to be paying 3 mils. We're only paying 2.7 because of Headley, so that would raise another quarter of a mil. But in any event, what we said is from a Headley Override, we would take 1.8 mils and put that towards the roads. So now we're at 3 mils between the general operating fund and Headley, and so what that leaves us is a gap of 2.7 mils to get to that number that we wanted to get to. And so to raise that additional 2.7 mils, what we would propose, again, is put another initiative on the ballot to do a public safety millage for 10 years. And what a public safety millage is, it basically says we're going to raise money for the police and the fire department. Okay? And so if we put that on the ballot and it was approved, what would happen is we would get 2.7 mils in new taxes from the residents that we could put towards, police, or just refer to as public safety. And what that would end up doing is that would mean that would free up 2.7 mils that we were currently putting towards public safety from our general operating fund. It would be freed up. So we could then dedicate that 2.7 mils to the roads. So it's a little bit of a shell game, but it is legal, and it's actually a technique that cities are doing all across the state to raise money for other types of projects. In fact, I read an article recently that there are, in the upcoming elections, there are over 100 cities in Michigan that are doing a public safety millage to free up funds to spend on other important projects for the city. So again, it's a little bit of a shell game, but and it's a little confusing to explain to residents, but it is something that we could do to raise another 2.7 mils. And so if we did that, we would end up raising 5.7 mils in total, which would get us $850,000 every year for 10 years. And again, we could do a pretty substantial road project every year for those 10 years. So now, in terms of what that means to your pocketbooks, in terms of additional tax, so obviously with the public safety millage, that would raise 2.7 mils that you're not paying now. The Headley Override would bring back roughly about 2.1 mils. So that would mean relative to what you're paying out actually today, you'd be paying out 4.8 mils more than today. And to put it in terms of your actual costs, again, the average taxable value of a home in Lathrup Village, this is the average, and this is the taxable value, not the value you could sell your home for, but it's $67,000. And so 4.8 mils on $67,000 is $320 per year to the average homeowner. So if your taxable value was higher, you'd pay more, a little bit more. If it was lower, you'd pay a little bit less. But the one thing I do want to mention is the Headley Override here really is not a new tax. As much as it is eliminating a tax break that you're currently getting due to Headley, because according to our charter, all residents are supposed to be paying 20 mils, but right now we're paying a little bit more than 18 because of Headley. And in fact, as recently as 2017, we were paying that 20 mils. So technically it's not really a new tax, it's the elimination of a tax break. So in some regards, it's really only 2.7 mils in new taxes. And then lastly, as part of this plan, we would then ask City Council to pass a resolution to dedicate 5.7 mils to road improvements for the next 10 years. Okay, so that's the first plan. Again, this is the one that we'll spend the most time talking on because it is the most confusing. So let's now talk about what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this particular plan. So in terms of the pros, it's a much less aggressive approach relative to last November. It's got a smaller millage rate. So last November, I think we were asking 8.3 mils. Here, it would be, what did I say, 4.8 mils, and some of that is actually not even a new tax. We're doing less repaving. We'll probably do, in this proposal, probably around 10 miles or so of road, whereas in the proposal in November, we were doing 26 miles of road. And then the payback period is significantly shorter. Residents said, 19 years was too long, so we dropped it, gave in this option to 10 years. This plan allows maximum flexibility so that the city can address the most pressing needs as they change from year to year. So, for example, if we have some road that is at the, can still be rehabbed, but it's at the near end of its rehab life, and we feel that another winter it's going to move into the full reconstruction category, which is much more expensive, we have the ability to change tack and say, all right, well, we'll work on that road now. So it does give us a lot more flexibility. It also gives us the ability to continually coordinate with other projects. So, for example, as we do water mains, the worst thing to do would be to put in a new road and then 2 years later realize we have to replace the water main and then we have to break up that road again. So it gives us the ability to coordinate other types of projects with the road replacements. And then the next one here is the city can use all $850,000 that it raises through this millage to do new road improvements. We do get some state, it's called Act 51 money that we get from the state for roads, and it's dedicated for local roads. And we'd be able to use that money. It would cover all of the non-road improvement costs that we have to cover. So every year we spend about $100,000 on pothole repair, salting the roads, removing the snow, doing tree removal, road signs, and so forth. And so that Act 51 money that we're getting, that little amount that we do get every year, would cover the cost of that, allowing us to spend the whole $850,000 on improving our roads. And then one huge advantage of this plan has to do with 11 Mile Road. So in the next few years, we're going to have to redo 11 Mile Road, and we own that road, so we're responsible for the cost. And it's going to cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of about $1.3 million. And we currently do get some money for major roads as well through Act 51. But what we've been doing every year is we've been transferring the maximum amount that we're legally allowed from the major road fund to the local road fund so that we have enough money to do that 0.4 miles of road that we do every summer. So if we pass this particular plan, we'd already be getting the $850,000 that we need for the road, so we wouldn't have to do that transfer, which would allow us to bank that Act 51 money for major roads so that when the bill comes for the $1.3 million, we have a lot of money in the savings account ready to pay for it. So that would be a big benefit to this particular plan as well. We get to do a significant road project every year. We can pave around 10 miles of road over the 10-year life of the millage. We can't really define exactly how much because it's going to depend on which roads we decide to do every year. Some roads cost more to repair than others. I listed here as a pro that, while we are raising 5.7 mills for this, some of those mills, roughly about 2 of them, really isn't a new tax, it's just the elimination of a tax break. And then the other thing about this plan, because I know people will ask, is we scaled back the dirt roads that we would address. In the November ballot proposal, we talked about doing all the dirt roads, and here what we've done based on input from residents is we backed that off to do only the main thoroughfares that are entranceways into the subdivisions, and that's namely Meadowbrook and El Dorado. It's a very small amount. It's about 0.4 miles, 0.45 miles of road. And council could also, if they wanted to, decide to charge back a portion of those roads to the residents. So those are the pros. In terms of the negatives for this particular plan, the first one is that it's confusing and requires some explanation to understand. So it's possible that we could confuse voters, which would make them less likely to vote for it. So it is a complex plan. It's a very good plan, very solid plan, but it does require some explanation. Another negative of this plan is that it is possible that, say, the Headley Override passes and the public safety millage doesn't pass, or vice versa. Now, if that happened, it wouldn't kill the plan. It would just mean that instead of getting $850,000 a year for roads, we would get less money, maybe $600,000. I don't know what the exact math is, but that is a risk with this particular proposal. And then the last piece here is technically a future city council. So we may have a different city council, different council members in 2-3 years. A future council could say, well, who has a different appetite and may not care as much about the roads as in terms of other projects, they could say, all right, well, you know what, I'm going to take that 2.7 mils from public safety, and we're going to put it towards a really slick gazebo for a farm, for a farmer's market or a dog park or what have you. So one of the reasons why we talked about having City Council pass a resolution to dedicate 5.7 mils every year is because what that would do is that would make it essentially political suicide for any future council to try to raid that money to do something else with it. It wouldn't be illegal for them to do it, but it would certainly make it very difficult because we have a very engaged citizenry in Lathrup Village, and if they tried to do that, there would be 100 people at every council meeting holding up a copy of that resolution saying, this money was promised towards the road. So I think that would act as a huge deterrent to any future council, trying to raid those funds. But technically, they could try to do that. Okay. So that's the first plan. So again, that was the one that was going to take the most amount of time to discuss. It's the most complex. The other two are easy, and we'll go a little faster. But basically, raising $850,000 over 10 years, adding 4.8 mils, to pay for it. Okay, so that's Plan 1. So now let's look at Plan 2. Plan 2 is very similar to what we did last November from the perspective that it's a defined project that's paid for with a debt service millage. So again, when you do a project like that and you pay for it with a debt service millage, you're not limited by that 20 mil cap that I talked about a little bit earlier. But in this particular example, what we're doing is we're scaling back the scope quite dramatically. And so what we're doing here is, we're scaling back the scope in terms of the mileage of road that's being done, and we're paying it back over 10 years instead of 20, and it's got a much lower millage rate. So what we're saying here in this particular plan is that we're going to work on a portion of the city's worst local roads. Okay, so we have about a little over 6.5 miles of asphalt road that need rehabilitation. And as a reminder, there are 3 different ways we can work on our roads. We can resurface them, which is just a very basic, minimal touch, which is relatively cheap. We can rehab them, which is moderate in cost, and then we can reconstruct them fully, which is very, very high cost. So right now we're talking about the moderate cost rehabilitation. So we've got about 6.6 miles of local road that need rehab. And what we're saying here is, to keep things scaled back, we can't do all of it, but let's do about 2/3 of those roads. Let's do 4 miles of it. And that would end up with a bill of about $1.8 million. And then we have 4 miles of asphalt road that need full reconstruction. That's the really expensive kind of construction. So what we're saying here is let's do 3 miles of that, about 75% of our roads needing full reconstruction, and that'll cost $2.9 million. So you can see it's fewer miles and it's significantly more expensive than the rehab. And then again, the main thoroughfares that we talked about of gravel, we wouldn't do all the gravel roads, just a very small portion, which is about $390,000. So in this particular project, then we would end up doing a total of 7.5 miles of road. Again, the worst roads in the city, and it would cost us about $5.1 million. And so what that would equate to is a millage rate of roughly about 3.75 mils. And so again, based upon the average taxable value of a home being $67,000 in Lathrup, that would mean it would cost $251 for the average homeowner for 10 consecutive years. Again, if you have a higher taxable value, you'd have to adjust that upward. If you had a lower taxable value, you would adjust it downward. And so for this particular project, all the construction would be done in 2 years. So we would do the 7.5 miles up front in 2 years. Again, it would be paid for over 10 years, fixes about 7.5 miles of local road, which is 28% of our local road. Once those two years were done, then what we would do is we would return back to the normal 0.4 miles of repaving a year. So we could go back and, we only did 3/4 of the full reconstruction. So, maybe we could do 0.4 miles of reconstruction that we didn't get to during the project. The mix of roads up here could be tweaked. We could tweak it up or down based upon input, but we wanted to try to, keep it under about 4 mils in this example. So, we came up with the number of miles in each category that we did. So again, a much more straightforward plan, 10-year, paid for with a debt service millage, 3.75 mils. We do 7.5 miles of road, and it would cost the average resident $250 a year. So let's move on to the pros and cons of that particular plan. So in terms of the plan pros, it's much easier to sell to residents because it doesn't require the explanation of a public safety millage or a Headley Override, which is somewhat confusing. Again, it's a defined project and paid for by a debt service millage, so it doesn't count towards the 20 mil cap. It's significantly lower cost and less extreme than the November proposal. So we're talking 3.75 mils versus 8.3 mils last November. Instead of doing 26 miles of road, which we were going to do in November, we're only doing 7.5. And again, it's paid for in 10 years instead of 19. So it's significantly has a significantly smaller scope than last November. Again, for 2 years anyways, the city would be able to bank its major road fund money so to help pay for the $1.3 million that we have coming for 11 Mile Road in the next few years. And if it's successful and well received, after 10 years, residents can approve another similar project to go back and get some of the other roads that we missed. Or even before that, if 5 years in they said, hey, this worked out real well, let's do it again to address some of the roads we missed, that could happen. In terms of the negatives, only 28% of our roads are addressed. Although some of those roads that are, although those roads that will be addressed are some of the worst roads, it's still only 28% of our road stock. It doesn't provide much flexibility, so to coordinate with other projects. So if we do this project and a year later, a water main needs to be replaced, we may have to tear up a new road to do it. And then this project doesn't address any of the concrete roads. We focused to keep the millage rate down. We focused on the asphalt roads and didn't do anything with our 4 miles of concrete roads. So concrete roads wouldn't be touched under this plan. And then also remember that we only did a portion of those roads, asphalt roads, that needed full reconstruction or rehabilitation. So it does leave some roads undone, which we would have to address, at some point in the future. So that's Plan 2. Okay. And then lastly, Plan 3 here. This is actually a plan that came up from in the public comment section of our last meeting. About 5 minutes from the end. It was suggested by several of the residents that were not in favor of the plan that we had in last November, that had we done a long-term plan that fixed a large percentage of our roads but wasn't as expensive, the 8.3 mils that we talked about last November, that may have been acceptable to a majority of the voters. So after hearing that, we went back and we kind of made another a Plan 3 option. We originally only had 2 plans, and we came up with this third plan, which is a pretty good plan, in that this particular plan would address all the roads, all the local roads in the city, with the exception of those 9.5 miles that are in really good shape right now. So basically the 9.5 miles of road that last November we said would just get the light resurfacing. We're not going to touch those roads because they're in pretty good shape and they're going to survive for another 10 years or so. So we'll just touch all the other roads that are in bad shape. So and we'll still pay it back in 20 years, but it'll be a much lower millage rate. So let's look at the roads that would be done there as part of this plan. So you can see here we've got asphalt roads. There's a couple of different categories in terms of reconstruction with a slightly different cost per mile, but you can see we've got roughly about 5 miles here of asphalt roads that need reconstruction. So we would reconstruct all of those roads. Again, with the gravel roads, similar to the other 2 plans, we would just do the major thoroughfares that are gravel, which is a very small portion, about 0.45 miles of road. Here's the 6.6 miles of road, that asphalt road that need rehabilitation. We would do all of that. But you'll see here the big zero. we have 9.5 miles of road that would fall into the resurface category, but we're not going to do any of that road because it's still in pretty good shape. And then here you can see the concrete roads in this plan are also addressed. Those concrete roads that need reconstruction, heavy patching, and light patching would all be addressed. So when we get down to the bottom, you can see that we're doing 16 miles of road here. That's a pretty substantial amount of road work, given we have only 26 miles of local road in the city. So we would do a lot of road, and that would come up to a cost of about just under $10.5 million. Okay. And again, we would pay this example back in 20 years. So this would be a long-term plan, and that would keep the millage rate down to about 3.7 mils. So again, for the $67,000 average homeowner, that would be $248 per year every year for 20 years. The project itself would take 3 to 4 years. So we would do all the work for those 16 miles of road would be done in 3 to 4 years. Again, the 0.45 miles of dirt road. And then after the 3 to 4 year project was done, the city would then return to addressing about 0.4 miles of road every summer. But then we could go back. You're getting some of those 9.5 miles of road that didn't get touched. Some of those over those 3 and 4 years, may start to go bad, and we can in a much more proactive manner begin to address those roads, even if we're only doing 0.4 miles of road a year. So the good thing about this particular plan, while it is a long-term plan, when we were done with this project in 3 to 4 years, our road system would be really, really good overall. We would have really good roads in our city. So let's talk about the pros and the cons of this particular example. So in terms of the strengths, all of our current bad road gets addressed. So all the bad roads get fixed within 4 years. Again, it's a much easier sell job to the residents because it's very straightforward. It does about 60% of our roads. It does provide some flexibility because the project is going to occur over 4 years, so it does give us some flexibility to schedule other projects around it. It is a defined project and paid for by a debt service millage, so it doesn't count against the 20 mil cap, so we would be allowed to put it on the ballot. Again, it's lower cost and less extreme than the November proposal, so instead of 8.3 mils, it's 3.77 mils. And instead of doing 26 miles of road, we're only doing about 16 miles of road. But it is a 20-year proposal, which was similar to the November proposal. And again, just like some of the other plans, it will allow us to bank our major road State Act 51 money to save up for the 11-mile road project. And again, we would use all the money that's levied through those 3.7 mils to improve the roads, and non-road improvement costs could be covered by the small amount of local Act 51 money we do get from the state. In terms of the negatives, it's a 20-year payback period, so it is a long payback period. And then roads that are in decent shape now and not addressed through this plan, some of them could go bad during the 20-year payback period. But again, we can handle some of these roads through the once we revert back to the normal 0.4 miles that we do every summer. So those are the 3 plans. Just real quick review. Plan 1 was the raising $850,000 every year for 10 years. It would cost 4.8 mils, and we would be able to do about 10 miles of road, and that was the one where we raised the funds through the general fund, the Headley Override, and the public safety millage. Plan 2 was one where we said, let's look at some, not all, but some of the more worse off roads in the city, so 7.5 miles of road. It would cost 3.75 mils and be paid off over 10 years. It would be a 2-year project, and it would address about 28% of the roads. And then Plan 3, which we just talked about, which would do 16 miles of road, but we would pay it back over 20 years, and it would be 3.7 mils per year. The initial work would be a 4-year project, and it would cover about 60% of our roads. So that's the road piece that I said I was going to talk about. In a couple minutes, we'll open it up. I know people will have a lot of questions. Some of it is a little confusing, and I know people will have a lot of questions on why we came up with some of the things that we did, and hopefully even some suggestions and maybe some strong opinions about which plan seems better for the community. But the last thing I want to talk about before we get to that point is the other related infrastructure system, which is our ditches. And from a background, we talked a lot about this during the last November, is that without doing any type of ditch repair, the life of our roads, we don't get the full life out of our roads. It's estimated that we lose about 10% of the life of the road. So instead of a road lasting for 20 years, it's probably going to last for about 18 years. And so what that means is if we don't fix our ditches, then we're essentially wasting about 10% of the cost of the project. And last November, it was City Council's attitude that they really didn't have an appetite for fixing the roads without fixing the ditches, because we as City Council members act as the city's fiduciaries, and it didn't seem like a responsible thing to do to spend money on a road that we're not going to get the full expected life out of it. It wouldn't be a wise use of tax dollars. And that doesn't even get into the fact that, the non-functioning ditches help insects breed. It's caused the explosion of rodents in our community, and that the constant water buildup, degrades our sidewalks and our driveway approaches in addition to the roads themselves. So initially, after the defeat of the proposal in the election in November, the Infrastructure Committee very seriously considered recommending a standalone, separate, citywide ditch improvement program to be paid for by a special assessment. So basically what we had talked about was, taking the entire cost of the program, dividing it up by the 1,600, 1,700 homes that we have in Lathrup, and everybody pays the same thing, which kind of addresses, some of the feedback we got from last November, is trying to do things so that everybody pays equally. So we had talked pretty serious about that, but when we got into the details of putting it together, the costs actually ballooned substantially. So back in November, when we had that comprehensive program, the ditching project consisted of about $4 million of that overall cost. But when we went to do it as a standalone project, the cost ballooned to well over $6 million. And the reason why is because when we do it as a standalone project, we can no longer leverage all of the synergies between the two types of projects. So for example, when you do a ditch improvement program, one of the most expensive things is actually breaking out the driveway approach to get to the culverts, the non-functional culverts underneath, the tube that carries the water from one side of the ditch to the other, and replacing it, and then repaving the driveway. Well, when you do the ditching with the roads, wherever that has to take place, in a lot of instances with the road project, the driveway approaches have to be repaved anyways, because the new height of the road doesn't match the height of the driveway approach. So the road program was essentially paying for that in the combined program. But when we do it as a standalone, the residents would have to pick up that cost of that very expensive cost of all that concrete work. And so the price kind of ballooned up, and so we were kind of at a loss and weren't quite sure what to do. And as we were discussing it at one of our meetings, we got some suggestions from some residents that we really took to heart. And the first one was, the residents mentioned that, it really doesn't make sense to separate out ditching from the roads. They really are something that need to be done together, because we need to offer that savings to the residents. It doesn't make sense to make residents potentially pay twice to have the same thing done. So we heard them, and we heard them pretty clearly. And then the other suggestion was that we should only be repairing the ditches on the specific roads that get paved. So again, we took those two suggestions to heart when we developed our proposal for improving our ditches. And so the ditch proposal that we have basically says that ditch repairs are only going to be done on those streets that are repaved. And the ditch repair that will get done is the same that we talked about last November. So it's jet cleaning out the functional culverts, replacing the non-functional culverts under the driveways, and then grading the ditches so that they flow appropriately, so that they work the way that they were supposed to work. So only the streets that are repaved would have their ditches worked on. And then the cost of these repairs would be paid for by the residents of a given city block via special assessment and paid back over 10 years. And then the cost to repair the block ditch system would be split evenly between those residents on that city block. So each block works as a separate system, and so again, listening to what residents said in terms of wanting to be able to try to make things more equal, the overall cost of fixing the ditch system for that block would be split by the residents of that block. Okay, and I want to be very clear here so that there's no confusion. This ditching is an additional cost. It would only be for the residents who have their streets done, but it is an additional cost above and beyond what any millage increases that you would be paying for one of the 3 road plans that we talked about earlier. Okay, so it's an additional cost over what you're paying for the roads, but it would only affect those people whose roads are repaved and ditches need to be done. Now, the other thing to mention is that the cost for the ditches is going to be somewhat variable from block to block. Streets that have ditches that are in good condition will have lower costs. Streets that have ditches that are in poor condition will have higher costs, again, to be split among all the residents on that street. And well, I'll talk about this in the pros, but and then the other thing that we talked about in the committee, because this is being done via a 10-year special assessment, anytime there's a special assessment, residents can vote down a special assessment with a simple majority. So if a particular block, like my street, if Sunnybrook got together and went to the public hearing for the special assessment, and more than 50% of the people said that they did not want the special assessment to occur, then it would be voted down. And so what we would suggest is that to City Council is that any street that votes down the special assessment doesn't get repaved, because again, as the city's fiduciaries, it would be paying tax dollars for something that we wouldn't get the full benefit from, because that road wouldn't last the full life of the road because the ditches weren't repaired. So to kind of summarize, while all residents would be paying for any approved road program, only those residents whose streets are fixed will receive and pay for ditch repair, and that cost would be split evenly among the residents of that block over 10 years from the special assessment. So that's the program. Let's look at it and what that means in terms of cost, and then let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of that plan. So what I did is I just went and did an estimate using the engineer's guidelines. I just randomly took 6 different blocks in the 4 quadrants of the city and calculated what our estimated cost would be to do the ditching for those blocks. And you can see it varies pretty dramatically from street to street. And it's really a function of the mileage of that block. So how long is the city block, and how densely compacted are the homes? If there's a lot of homes, smaller yards and a lot of homes, that means there's more people to split the cost with, and the cost will be lower. If you're in the estate section where you have big wide lots, then it's going to cost more because there's fewer homes to split the cost with. So in this example, you can see if you look at something like Cambridge, east of Southfield Road to the city line, those residents on Cambridge would be paying about $287 per year because they have pretty wide lots over there. So there wouldn't be a lot of houses to cover the cost. So in terms of $287, that essentially equates to about 4 mills for the average homeowner. And so let's say, for example, the voters approved Plan 2 or Plan 3 that we talked about. Both of those plans were about 3.7 mills. So in this example, somebody who lives on Cambridge would be paying 3.7 mills for the road, as well as another 4 mills for their ditches. So in total, they would be paying about 7.7 mills. So it would be a little bit more expensive for them. Still less than what they would have been paying in terms of 8.3 mills last November, But again, this is going to be somewhat variable depending on the street. Now, Saratoga in this example was the lowest cost, and I know, like I said, I randomly picked these streets, and I didn't notice at the time that Saratoga was a dirt road, but let's just assume pretend it's concrete. So the residents on that block, if their roads were done, it would be $121 per year, which equates to 2 mills for those residents, for the average homeowner. So in that example, they'd be paying 3.7 mills for the roads, plus another 2 mills for their ditches, so it would be about 5.7 mills. So again, that's about a little less than 3 mills less than what they would have been paying in November. And again, if you had somebody who lives on a street that wasn't getting repaved, so the people who live on those roughly 10 miles of roads that don't get if we went with Plan 3 and you had those 10 people who 10 miles worth of homes that weren't getting repaved, those people wouldn't be paying anything additional for their ditches. So we really did it this way because one of the things that was said at many of the town halls last November was, well, our ditches are working fine. Why do I have to pay for everybody else's ditches? So this really makes it a little bit more equitable in that residents are only paying for the work that their particular street needs, and they're only paying for their street. So that gives a little bit of a background in terms of what the costs kind of look like. But again, it's also going to be very dependent on what the condition of the ditches are in each particular block. Again, better shaped ditches would be less cost. Bad ditches would be higher cost. In terms of the positives, the city corrects a long-term problem that's degrading our roads, our sidewalks, and our driveways, and is also causing lots of other problems like insects and rodent population explosions. Significant savings are preserved and passed on to residents. So we're still leveraging the work that we would be doing for the roads and taking advantage of that to fix the ditches at a significantly lower cost. Only residents who have ditch work done pay for the ditch program. Residents only pay for the work that their system requires. Costs are evenly split, and residents have 10 years to pay for the work. So those are the plan pros. In terms of the negatives associated with this particular plan, the biggest negative is really not every street gets ditch improvements. Only those streets that get worked on. So the percentage of streets that actually get new ditches would depend on which particular road plan the voters was put in front of the voters and the voters approved. So Plan 1, that was the $850,000 a year for multiple funding sources. If you remember, that plan was going to do roughly about 10 miles of road, which is about 40% of our roads, which would mean about 40% of our ditches would get done. Plan 2 was the one where we did just some of the worst roads, 7.5 miles of the worst roads. That encompasses 28% of our local road system, which would mean only 28% of our ditches would get fixed. And then Plan 3, that was the one that was the 20-year plan, which does about 16 miles of road, all the bad roads in the city. That covers 62% of our road system, so 62% of our ditches would get fixed. So a lot more of our ditches would get fixed with this particular plan than the other two. Now, the other thing I just want to mention, because we actually do have certain city blocks within Lathrup Village that are actually looking into doing this. Any block who was not slated for road repairs, they could come to City Council and ask for a special assessment to be put on their block to fix their ditches. And we actually have a couple streets that are seriously looking at doing that. They're kind of waiting to see what's going on with the road proposal and whether or not we put anything on the ballot in November. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information, but now what I'd like to do is we really want to hear what your input is. We'd love to hear which plan you prefer, which one you think makes the most sense. Want to hear what you like and don't like about the plans. If you have any ideas, we'd love to hear them. In order to, everybody has been put on mute right now, so your phone lines are dead. But what you can do is that if you want to make comments, if you're on the Zoom meeting, up at the top, you have the ability to raise your hand chat or do a Q&A. So if you do any of those options, Cheryl's going to be, our city administrator is going to be monitoring for that. And if we see a comment come in or a Q&A, or if somebody clicks on the raise hand option, I think you have to, where is the raise hand button? I don't see it on my screen, but that might be because I'm a panelist. But you can raise your hand. And then for those of you who are on the phone only, if you want to make comments, what you need to do is hit the star key followed by the 9. So star 9, and that will alert Cheryl that you want to make a comment, and she can then unmute your phone. So Cheryl will announce your name when it's your turn to speak, so that you know that you've been unmuted. So if you can go ahead, and if you have comments or questions and you want to say something during the public comment section, go ahead and do that. While you're figuring out how to raise your hand or doing the star 9 on the phone in only people, I'm going to ask Cheryl to open it up and let the panelists make any comments that they want to make. So if they have anything that they want to say, or if they want to correct me if I made any mistakes, or chime in for things that I may have forgotten, I want to give them a chance to. So if you could unmute them and let them make any comments that they'd like, you could do so at this time, Cheryl, that'd be great.
All of the panelists are unmuted on my end. They may need to unmute individually on their own computer. So.
All right, thanks, Cheryl. Panelists, anybody?
I'll start. Even though proposal 1 is maybe a little bit difficult for people to understand, it's like the more you hear it, the more you understand it and the working pieces of it. I think that's a good proposal. I like proposal 2 the best.
Okay. Other comments from the panelists?
I had a couple. One is, and I don't know if we covered this, is someone lives on a corner and one side is being done and the other side isn't, or both sides are being done. Are they paying for ditches on both sides of their house?
I don't think we ever thought through that. We'd have to figure that out, but I'm guessing they probably, well, I don't know. I mean, I would think logically we would only do the ditch on the side that was where the construction was taking place, but I guess that's something that we'll need to, talk about as a committee and decide what would make sense in that situation.
Or I guess even if say their house faced a street and the side street that they live on was being done, would they have to pay for the ditch on the side street? You know what I mean? Their driveway comes off of a road that's being done. And I was just thinking, because we were looking at Saratoga, I know, there's a couple of houses on the corner there that it's gravel on the side, and then Santa Barbara on the other side. And,
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I don't know how that would work if someone would have to pay for if they would be included in paying for the ditch, or is one of the homeowners that would pay for it, or if they would not, because it would affect how much everybody else would pay, and then also would affect them if they had to pay for ditches on both sides of their home.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think some things like that. I mean, another example that we talked about, I think this might have been before you were on the committee, Michael. Like rain gardens would be an issue. Some of them are functional, some of them aren't. And we talked about some of those things having to be decided administratively. Now, we could talk about this at our next committee meeting and see what the committee thinks we ought to do. It might be something that we leave up to administrative decision. But again, we can talk about that at the next meeting.
And I guess of the 3, I guess I could go for either 1 or 2, but the 20-year plan, I think, again, is just, I would, if I had my druthers, I'd rather see something less than 10 years, but, that's something I guess we can talk about.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Mike Keenan, anything? Okay. All right, Cheryl, do we have people who want to make comments in the public comment section?
Their hand.
You have one question in the chat, Cheryl.
Okay.
Yeah, I see that in the Q&A. Yeah, so I'll answer the question in the Q&A. So it says, is there a map of the city that shows which roads will be worked on for each plan? You know, in the first plan, the answer to that is no, because basically what would happen with the first plan is we would raise that $850,000 each year, and then we would, similar to what we do now for our annual paving program, we would essentially just have a lot more money for the annual paving program. So we would decide the previous winter which roads we were doing in the following spring, dependent upon the conditions of the roads at that time. In the second plan, where we would do the 7.5 miles of road, if we decided to go with that plan, then yes, we would more than likely have discussions in terms of which roads the committee would have discussions in terms of which roads we would do. So for example, I think we said we would do 75% of the asphalt roads that require full reconstruction. So we would have to decide essentially which of those three of 4 miles gets done in our recommendation to council. So that would be something that voters would know well in advance. In Plan 3, we would be able to, again, tell you which roads, because it would basically be all of the roads other than the 9.5 miles that are in a category that would require just simple resurfacing. And we know which roads those are, so we could very easily publish those once we get more towards a decision more towards a decision as to whether or not we're going to put something on the ballot, and if so, which one of the 3 plans. So similar to last time, I don't know how much you looked at the documents that we did. We put out last November. We put out a map that showed every road and what type of construction it would receive and when it would receive the construction. So we would definitely be doing something similar to the extent that we can. Cheryl, were there any other questions? I mean, there's still, I think there's 8 people on. I don't know if they want to speak or not. We'd love to hear your comments.
If you'd like, I can go through each name individually and unmute them to see if they have something to say.
Yeah, or maybe even, I don't know if this would turn it into a free-for-all, but maybe just unmute everybody, because there's only 9, I was looking at 8 or 9 people that are connected, so it's not too many.
Okay, everyone is unmuted.
Okay, so everyone's unmuted. If anyone has any questions, comments, let us know which plan you like best and why. The info would be great.
Sandra has raised her hand.
Okay.
Hi there. To begin, I'm really impressed with all 3 plans and the various angles you took with this. I will say that I am really liking plan number 1.
Which plan?
Number 1.
Okay.
just to make you have to explain it ad nauseum.
Yeah, I can envision all sorts of town halls in the future, having to go over, Headley again, like I did last year, or last November, but yeah, what is there something particular that you like about that plan?
I like the flexibility. I like the, it really kind of looks really long-term at all the needs and integrates it well, I think.
Okay. All right, anybody else? Don't be shy.
There's
All right,
another question in the Q&A.
Yeah, okay, so in the Q&A, it says, for Plan 3, have you considered a shorter payment period such as 15 years? That's something that we could definitely do. If we did it over 15 years instead of 20 years, that means the millage rate would go up by 25%. So we were at 3.7 for that one, so that would take the millage rate up to about 4.6. And so one of the things that we were trying to do in that plan is based on the suggestions that we had at that one meeting, was to try to keep the millage rate down as low as possible. If we did that, 4.6 mils is still significantly less than the 8.3 mils. But again, we have to remember that those residents whose roads would be done would also be having their ditches done, so they're going to have that expense too. So it's definitely something we can talk about in our subsequent meetings, because I think this is our third town hall, and what we're going to do is after this one we'll go back to meeting again as a committee and basically deliberating and trying to decide if we think it's the right time to put something on the ballot, and if so, which of these three plans. And we'll be able to hash out making minor changes to those plans, like changing the payback period from 20 to 15 years. So that's something we can definitely talk about. Anything else? Anyone? Don't be shy. All right. Well, if nobody wants to make any more comments, then I want to say I appreciate the people who took took an hour or so, hour and a half of their Thursday evening to come listen about roads and ditches. And stay tuned. We will announce our next meeting sometime soon. The meetings are open to the public, and if you want to come in and listen to us deliberate and provide comments during those meetings, you're welcome to do it, and we encourage you to do so. So other than that, everybody have a good night. Panelists, thanks for giving up your evening to attend. Appreciate it, and we'll see everybody soon. Be safe.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.